Quinn, can we hear you? Quinn, is your audio working okay?
Yeah, can you hear?
Yes, sounds good. Okay, we'll be starting shortly. Thank you.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone, to another ESU Happy Hour. My name is Bill Kennedy. I'm the president of the Cleveland branch and a member of the Happy Hour committee. It's an honor to be speaking on their behalf. Jeff Schnabel, Barbara Hughes, Julie Jardine, and our chairman, Dr. Karen Blair Brand. And welcome to today's presentation, hosted by our chairman, Dr. Quinn Peeper. Our speaker today is Flora Fraser, who will be speaking on the Scottish heroine and American loyalist, Flora Macdonald, her namesake. Again, the happy hours are brought to you by our members' suggestions and our branch suggestions. If you have an idea for a happy hour, there will be a form, a little survey at the end of this presentation. You'll be able to give us some suggestions for future happy hours. We have 2 more planned for this season. June 7th will be our happy hour hosted by the Lexington, Kentucky branch on the Evans Williams bourbon tasting. That should be very interesting. We're looking forward to that. And then a very special happy hour hosted by the Happy Hour Committee on June 21st on the celebrations of the King's coronation that just occurred on May 6th. All of our branches have been submitting their responses, their celebrations on that day, and we're looking forward to that very much. There will be an opportunity for questions. If you have questions at all during the presentation, please enter them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. On most screens, it might be at the top of your screen, wherever you see the chat symbol or the Q&A symbol. You can enter your questions at any time during the presentation. I will be operating as your interlocutor and be asking our speaker the questions that you submit. You can submit them at any time and they will be asked in order that we receive them. So if you already have questions, go ahead and submit them now. So without further ado, it's an honor and a privilege to introduce our host for this evening, Dr. Quinn Peeper.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, terrific. Well, I'm Quinn Peeper, and it's a great privilege to introduce to you today Flora Fraser. ESU is a wonderful organization on so many levels, and the friendships that we build through ESU are fantastic, and certainly that is the case with Flora. I met her many years ago when New Orleans had an annual general meeting, and the theme was biography. And Flora came and sat on a panel. She stayed with Michael and I at our house, and we became such good friends. Since that time, she has participated in other ESU events. There was an annual general meeting in New York, and she went to my alma mater to prepare for that book, The Washingtons. And she gave a speech at the annual general meeting at that meeting in New York. But Flora is from this fascinating line of biographers, and it's fascinating to me because it seems to pass through the female line. I have here is a biography of her grandmother, Elizabeth, by her grandmother, Elizabeth Longford, on Wellington. And in fact, Flora and her mother, Antonia, and here's the book by Antonia that I have in my office. I'm in my office right now. At home, I have loads of biographies from them because they occupy many shelves. But Antonia and Flora actually have a literary prize established in their forebear's name, the Longford Prize. But Flora's books, I've read them all. The characters are very lively, and you know, the saddest one that I read was the daughters of George III, because you know everyone's going to die because these are all 18th century, 19th century heroines, and I was on the sixth princess, and I just couldn't kill her off by finishing the book. It was so good. So I think those last few pages I'll have to get to one day. But without any further ado, I'm going to leave you in fantastic company. Please welcome Flora Fraser.
Thank you, Quinn, and thank you, Bill. It's a huge pleasure to be here and enjoying Happy Hour, a great invention. So I'm raising my Highland Whisky Sour to the committee and also to all of you watching at home. And it could have been a Highland whisky-less sour, which I provided the recipe for also, but I think, you know, British time, we're well into the evening. So cheers. And I would like to share with you my Magic Lantern show about Flora Macdonald, a Scottish heroine that I was named after. And I think you'll see as we proceed through her life that there are modern echoes, and also there's the extraordinary daring that she showed in 2 civil wars, the Jacobite civil war or rising in 1745 in Scotland, and 30 years later she was caught up in the American Revolution in North Carolina. So here we go. Sorry, I'm using my left hand because I broke my right hand, so I'm a little slow with technology. But I want you to imagine and look at here Loch Ness in the Highlands of Scotland, and I'm sure that many of you have been to Loch Ness, and certainly growing up in the district, I was always looking for Nessie, as the Loch Ness monster was known, but I don't think it was the Loch Ness monster that these redcoat officers are looking for. The Duke of Cumberland, who was George II's second son, is commander-in-chief of a Hanoverian army, and they're based here at Fort Augustus, a fort which is still there on Loch Ness, and they are searching for Jacobite rebels after a battle of Culloden, which happened the other side of Inverness. So we're way up in the Highlands. And at that battle, a prince, a Stuart prince who'd grown up in exile in Rome, but was the grandson of James II of England and Scotland. This exile prince came over, raised an army of Highlanders, and set off south to seize the throne from the Hanoverian king, George II. Well, they got within 100 miles of London, but they were beaten back, and the Stuart prince, who is known to most of us today as Bonnie Prince Charlie, and his real name was Prince Charles Edward Stuart, he was defeated way down. If you look down between those hills at the end of Loch Ness, out there past Inverness, at the bloody Battle of Culloden, and those who weren't taken prisoner, the Highlanders and the prince, all fled west, and the prince fled west so that he could get a ship to France. So he was aiming for the west coast of Scotland. So this is, if you like, the back history in the summer of 1746, and in the wake of the 45, as it's still called up there, the 1745 rebellion by the Highland Scots against Hanoverian rule. And these, as you can imagine, these are the redcoats who are going out searching for the prince and for Jacobite or Scottish Highland chiefs who've managed to escape the battlefield. So many others, both officers, men, chiefs and clansmen were killed on the battlefield itself. And remote from all this is the subject of my book, Flora Macdonald. She's a very normal Scottish gentlewoman, not of great rank, but growing up in comfortable circumstances in the very remote Western Isles or Outer Hebrides. And as you can see, she's got the Celtic good looks that one sees so much in the Highlands, that fair skin with pink cheeks and the blue eyes and the dark hair. And we know that she was petite, but an elegant figure. Now, she was hadn't been involved in the 45. Her clan, the Macdonalds of Clan Ranald in the Western Isles, hadn't come out for the prince, as it was called when he joined the army, and nor had any of the chiefs on Skye, which was the large island 30 miles off across a channel called the Minch. So she was living in territory which had not been touched by this by this civil war, this conflict. But when she was minding her brother's cattle on one of these islands, one of the Outer Hebridean islands, she was minding her brother's cattle and alone or possibly with a maidservant in a bothy or a shepherd's hut at midnight. And suddenly this apparition came to her, which was a raggy-taggy, bearded, fugitive prince with a cousin of hers. And he was wearing, the prince, far from being the courtly gentleman that he had grown up as in Rome at the Pope's court, far from being the elegant figure in blue velvet jacket when he had headed the Highland army going down to Edinburgh and Holyrood House. His face was covered in midge bites. There's particularly biting gnats, which you get near standing water in the Highlands. And we know that his face was, he found them, they were attracted to him, I think because he'd taken up drinking whiskey, which they like sweet blood. Anyway, there was the prince, and he said to Flora, would she take him over the Minch, this channel of 30 miles, across to Skye, because there were redcoats or Hanoverian officers within 2 miles. They'd tracked him down to this particular island, South Uist, and there was a plan that Flora, this 24-year-old unknown gentlewoman who, if the prince had never come calling, would have married a kinsman, would have settled down, would have been a country gentleman's wife, and would never have heard about her. But he said, would she dress him up as her Irish maid, Betty Burke, and take him dressed up? He was 6 foot, so he's going to be a pretty large Irish maid. Take him in this disguise over the sea to Skye. And of course, the song, Speed Bonny Boat Like a Bird on the Wing, over the sea to Skye. This is what he's proposing, and he's proposing that he go dressed as Betty Burke. Well, Flora is no Jacobite. She is not, as I've said, of a family who blindly followed the prince into the rash but dramatic attack on the British throne. But everyone in the Highlands had at least a secret sympathy for the House of Stuart, because they had been, it had been a dynasty in Scotland since the 14th century, in England only since the 17th century. So there was a great attachment to the House of Stuart, and it was hard for her to say no. However, she made sure that her cousin Neil came with them as her chaperone, because being alone with the Stuart prince, and it would definitely come out in the end, would do her no good in her later marriage ventures. So here you can see this is a very, very distinct, long, oval face, which all the Stuarts, his father, his grandfather had. So it was, when she finally agreed, it was going to be quite hard to disguise it. This scene of Flora offering the best of what she had in the bothy to the prince. There are many, many imaginary scenes, and here is a wonderful French depiction. It was nothing like this. She was woken at midnight and scrambled to put clothes on. However, she did go to the wife of the clan chief, and they did make a bonnet for Betty Burke. And here you see that oval face again. And in fact, this is an imaginary print. The cap that they made, in fact, covered more or less all of that very distinct high forehead, and so that the Stuart face was obscured, but the dress was more of a maidservant's dress than this one, but they did set off. There are many imaginings of this famous scene of Speed Bonny Boat o'er the sea, and in fact we know exactly what went on, and it wasn't as depicted here, where Flora is facing the storm with the prince lying in her lap. It was actually, we know because we have the testimony of the 4 oarsmen and the helmsman in this boat, which set off under cover of night. We know that she was the one who lay in as much comfort as they could get her in the boat, while the prince huddled, and it was she who was given the wine and the provisions that were on the boat. And in all ways, the prince treated Flora as though she were a great lady at the Vatican court in Rome. And in many ways, on this adventure to make his way back to Paris, he was at his very best. Here is the famous Sky boat song. The air is an old Gallic air, which was an English lady in the 19th century was being rowed across a lake, across a loch in Scotland, and she took down not the Gallic words, but she took down the air, and then a composer friend of hers, Sir Harold Bolton, produced the famous lyrics. And those of you who have watched Outlander will know that that it has the tune is although there are different lyrics again, the tune of the Sky Boat song is integral to every series, including the series in which Flora Macdonald herself appears. So there are many adventures, many of them comical, with the prince in his Betty Burke outfit. And as they progress over the hills and the dales of Skye, he's looked at askance by the country people who are coming back from church, because sometimes he's lifting his skirts way up, so to an indecent degree, and sometimes he's letting them trail in the burn or the stream that they're crossing. But eventually, at the inn, at the public house at Portree, the port in Skye, they say goodbye, and the prince is handed on. He resumes Highland dress, and he's handed on to other Highland chiefs who will, in fact, keep him safe back on the west coast of Scotland until he takes ship for France, all under the eyes, if you like, under the noses of the redcoats, who find everything out about his his travels with different Highlanders, including for this week, 10 days with Flora, but they only find it out after the event. And this is, again, a richly imagined scene. And the truth is that the publican, the innkeeper, was extremely suspicious who this gentleman was, who seemed to have a great deal of money to flash around. And there are some comical episodes in which Flora and her fellow Highlanders are shocked when the prince tells the innkeeper to keep the change, and no Scot would ever do that, and he's pretending to be a Scottish rebel in hiding. So the prince gets away, but Flora is taken prisoner because everything, as I say, is extracted as confessions from those who were with her, and Flora is taken south by different captors, a future Duke of Argyll on one ship, a Commodore on another ship, but they all treat her with incredible solicitude. And unlike the rest of the Jacobite prisoners who are treated as vermin and rabble down in the London courts, Flora, although she's a state prisoner for having conspired to against the king in helping this fugitive prince, she's actually put not in the Tower of London, that was reserved for peers of the realm, for noblemen, but she's put in this rather nice house by St. James's Park in Queen Anne Street. You can see Queen Anne here. And while all the clan chiefs with her, many of them from the Outer Hebrides and Skye, they're complaining, oh, we need fresh air in St. James's Park. Oh, we need a fire in the room. She's simply impressing more and more of those people she meets in London. She becomes famous, and this is just one of many engravings, and her portrait is taken too, because she said to her first captor, the future Duke of Argyll, when he said, "What made you do it? What made you help the prince?" She said, "I would have done the same for you had you been in distress." And it was this clemency, her motives, not of, as I say, of blind Jacobitism and, if you like, treasonable loyalty to a Catholic monarch in Rome. It was just that, stemming, I think, from her strong Presbyterian faith, it was very simple. She took pity on the prince. And this remark, "I would have done the same for you had you been in distress," echoed round London society and the newspapers. And this Lady Primrose, a Welsh heiress, was so impressed by Flora when a general amnesty in the summer of 1747 meant that Flora was allowed home, although she was guilty, as the attorney and solicitor general had decided in papers which proved not, no further action was taken and she was allowed to go home. But Lady Primrose got up a fund of £1,500 to send Flora back to London, back to to Scotland with. And this really became, I would multiply that by 100 to get the present price. And also you think of how far money went in the Outer Hebrides and Skye. So it was a colossal sum. So while Jacobites like my ancestor, Simon Lord Lovat, or Simon of the 45, had his head chopped off, which I think was a possibly fitting end to a career in which had seen him support the Hanoverians, then the Jacobites, and then the Hanoverians, and finally the Jacobites. Flora, seen here in a portrait by Ellen Ramsey, went home and married the factors, the son of the factor on Skye. So the factor was in effect the land agent for this estate. And I don't know if any of you have been to Skye and seen the Kirang, this extraordinary, it's a landslip, but you can see it's dramatic scenery. Anyway, at the foot of this landslip, Flora and her husband, Alan Macdonald of Kingsborough, made their home, and they were able to buy the lease from the clan chief, Sir James Macdonald of Slate, with the dowry that Flora had brought home. So on the one hand, her adventures with the prince had seen her taken prisoner down to London. On the other hand, she had come back with, as a very, very desirable wife. And Alan, her husband, had been educated down in Edinburgh by the clan chief with a view to him taking over from his father when his father retired. So here and later at they moved into Alan's family home, Floddigary. This is Floddigary, and they moved into the Kingsborough house, which was where Flora had the last of her children. She had 7 children in all, 5 sons and 2 daughters. And as the reign of George III began, the tyrant king who lost America, he's the grandson, not the son of George II. There was a Prince of Wales who died before succeeding to the throne. In the 1760s, life looked good for the Macdonald family, and as her sons grew, Flora wrote to her patrons in the south, and she had made wherever there was a society that had a smidgen of sympathy for the Stuart cause, if you like, she was a heroine, both in Edinburgh, in London, and she wrote to her numerous patrons and got her sons fitted out with, she got their uniforms, and in the case of one, she got one into the Bengal army, she got another into the Marines, another went down to the high school in Edinburgh and then into the law. So Alan, unfortunately, her husband wasn't proving, if you like, the man his father had been, who'd been a very successful factor for 30 years on the Macdonald of Slate estates. And Alan was let go as factor. And in fact, the money that Flora had brought into the marriage, finally there was no more left. And as Dr. Johnson, who's seen here on his walking tour in the Highlands, and he's seen Dr. Johnson's here again in brown with his young lawyer friend, James Boswell. They visit Flora and Alan in 1773. And in fact, Dr. Johnson sleeps in the bed where the prince slept at Kingsborough House when he stayed there with Flora when he was dressed as Betty Burke. But Flora says, Flora here in pink with a maidservant behind and a large portrait of the prince in this richly imagined conversation piece. But she says to Dr. Johnson and Boswell, "You were lucky to catch me because I'm off to America." And in this, she and Alan and their children are following parties, shiploads, 500 at a time. Highlanders are going from Skye, from the west coast of Scotland, and they're settling in many cases, and in the case of Flora, way up the Cape Fear River in North Carolina, where Scottish settlers have made a kind of Scottish Eden. It was then called Cross Creek. It's now Fayetteville. And the government legislation after the 45 has divorced the chiefs from the clans. It sent the chiefs down to London, who, having the more expensive style of life, then send for more money from their estates, which means the factors are jacking up the rents. And the islanders and the clansmen on the mainland can't afford this, so they sell up what they can. And there's this, for a very few years, because then the revolution breaks out, there are these shiploads of Scots going over, and Flora and Alan buy a plantation, and that's what they all want to do. They want to buy. It doesn't matter how mean it is. It's something nobody can, on a whim, increase the rents. And here's a marvelous picture of Flora and Alan going to Barbecue Church. Again, this is actually what Barbecue Church looked like, the Presbyterian church at the time when Flora and Alan lived outside Cross Creek. So you can see just how pioneer the whole town was. And actually going, what happened was that they'd hardly settled, or they lived comfortably for a year, and then having arrived in the spring of 1775, or possibly the winter before, they suddenly find that their son, Ranald Macdonald the Marine, is involved in some skirmishes in April in some places called Lexington and Concord outside Boston, and has been wounded. And what's more, he recovered to be, as a British Marine, in the Bunker Hill assault a month later. So the revolution is brought very, very early to their attention. But they never thought of joining the Patriots because in the 45 and in the French and Indian Wars, where many Highlanders served, they have seen the power of the British Crown. They've seen the British Crown defeat France, defeat Spain, and they want economic stability. And so they join. They join up with other loyalists, and down at and this rather, well, it's sort of rather misty but magical place, Moores Creek Bridge. The Patriots surprised the Highland Army, this militia force, which is going down to from Cross Creek to the coast, and they take the whole lot prisoner. And Alan and Flora's husband is sent out of the colony or nascent state to Philadelphia, and then outside Philadelphia as a prisoner of war, so that he can't foment more mischief. And Flora is left for 2 years ducking and diving, and she is brought up before the Revolutionary Committee, where apparently she answers with spirit. But after 2 years, her son-in-law, who, thank heavens, has some money, brings her out, her and her daughter and grandchildren, and they head for British-occupied New York. That's in 1778. But before we leave New York, it was just to say that, before we leave North Carolina, it's just to say that, in fact, Flora must be the only loyalist remembered in North America, or in America, with some affection. And the first ever vocational college for women was called Flora Macdonald College. And I've met many ladies of a certain age who had trained there as nurses and teachers. And this lovely Highland fling comes from a celebration. So as I say, she has left her mark, Flora, on North Carolina. But then they're in British New York, where Flora and Alan, thank heavens, are taken in by the Scotch folk, which means the Scottish merchants, most of them members of the St. Andrew's Society of New York, which is indeed still going today. And I think they would have been very happy staying there, but Alan is called to garrison duty with a Highland emigrant regiment outside Halifax, Nova Scotia. Flora, in fact, her health is deteriorating. And while the prince, seen here, I'm afraid a couple of years before his death, gives Flora no reward, or, little sign of his thanks. Oddly enough, when she comes back to Skye in her last years, and she dies at the age of 68 in 1790, the person who does give her a pension is the rather forward-looking Prince of Wales, who later becomes Prince Regent and George IV. And he was the first of the Hanoverians to see that incorporating Stuart history with all its romance into the slightly dull history of the Hanoverians was, you know, a smart move. And ever since George IV, really, and he was the first one of them to come to Edinburgh and make a great entrance, the Hanoverian family have been very attached right up to Scotland and the Highlands. Queen Victoria bought Balmoral. The late Queen, as you know, loved Scotland and died there. And the new king also has great feeling for Scotland. So with £50 a year from the prince, who thought that this remarkable woman shouldn't be left in penury, and with £100 a year from her son Johnny, who was the one who went to the high school in the law. In fact, he went out to Sumatra, where he became a very distinguished artillery officer, a founder member of the Royal Asiatic Society, and a member of the Royal Society. And Flora, like many Scots, was a great believer in education. And I think, although his success came after her death, she was certainly very grateful for the £100 a year, which he directed to her and not to his father, through whose hands money unfortunately just slipped. And so Flora is buried there. Those who go to Skye, it's difficult not to want to make a pilgrimage to her grave with this tall Celtic cross, looking out very much as it appears in this 19th century engraving. And to this day, I think that while the Bonnie Prince Charlie is a figure in history who is treated nowadays with a good deal of unkindness, perhaps not realizing that, you know, this was his one mission in life. He was trained to come back and restore the Stuart dynasty. And when that failed, the rest of his life was, I'm afraid, debauched and drunken. But Flora is still very much admired in Scotland, and I've found also, being in America during Tartan Week, I am so thrilled, I speak as her biographer, to know that her story has been travelled with the Scottish diaspora, so that young Scots or young people of Scottish heritage know the story of Flora. And I love to think that it's been told to them by grandmothers, or it's come down in the family. And I think it's a story worth telling and worth meditating on, because she didn't ask to be, you know, the prince's preserver. And if you like, when she went to America, she didn't ask to be thrown into the American Revolution, but she negotiated everything that was thrown at her with as much skill as she could and intelligence. And I think that her meeting with Dr. Johnson is one of the great meetings of the 18th century, two 18th century titans, if you like, and they absolutely adored each other. And you can read all about it in my book or indeed in Johnson and Boswell's account of their Highland tour. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flora. That was marvelous. And the book I should mention to our listeners tonight is Flora Macdonald, Pretty Young Rebel, Her Life and Story, which is published in the US by Knopf Publishers. So you can order that and get all of the backstory. She must have been a charming woman, not just intelligent, obviously to be remembered with a college in North Carolina. And
I know. It's and it's amazing. In the new Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, she's very much there as part of the story. I think now there's more interest in who were these loyalists, and she's part of a group who'd just arrived, had no idea of the strength of feeling in the country against the British government, hadn't suffered, she and her family hadn't suffered as Scots who had settled here earlier had, and they did become patriots. But in the Museum of the American Revolution, there she is. You press a pin to see in the interactive map of the 13 states, and you press the pin on North Carolina, and up comes Flora Macdonald, which must take some people by surprise.
it's interesting that the history of Flora in the Scottish diaspora in the United States. I can understand that being passed down. But I first heard of her obviously through the song, and it's interesting the way folk songs and traditional songs tell historical stories, and the history is transmitted across generations through music. But the impression one gets from that song is that she would have been a rebel, that she would have been.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to hear the real story, that no, she was just a kind woman who would have done that for anyone.
Yes. I mean, it's possible to say, oh, well, she was telling the general, the future Duke, what he wanted to hear, or what would please him, or what would get her better treatment. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that is the case. I mean, I think that she genuinely saw this as her duty, and it is part of Highland hospitality. It's part of ancient rules of Highland hospitality that you do you honor your guest, and that it's very important to provide hospitality for strangers. And so she only did, in a way, what she thought. There was nothing very remarkable in what she'd done, she said, until she found that everyone down in London thought it was very wonderful. That's what she said.
Yeah, that kind of Gallic or Celtic hospitality is a very noble thing, and it does elevate one's status, no matter what one's status is, I think, to extend that to others. We had I think you touched on this tangentially in your introduction, your early remarks. One of our listeners, Michael Boyd, says that he was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford in the late 50s, and there was an organization called the Dominion Fellowship Trust, which arranged for Commonwealth students and American Rhodes Scholars to spend up to a week during Oxford holidays with British families. The organization was founded by a lady named Miss Macdonald of Seat. And he wonders if that Macdonald is related to Flora Macdonald. I know the Macdonalds, there are septs and branches and families of the clan.
Yeah. But certainly, I mean, Sleat is her husband's, is Alan's clan, if you like, his sept.
His sept.
She's of the Clan Ranald. So I'm sure that it was, if I've heard it, was it Seat or was it Sleat?
I think it was he says Seat, but it may have been incorrect.
Well, maybe if it was Sleat, then it would, some people say Sleat, some people say Slate. But anyway, that is definitely the clan, the Macdonald clan of Skye. There's MacLeods too, and a couple of other ones, but the Macdonald of Sleat or Slate, that's definitely, and I don't think that it would have been an actual descendant of Flora, because I think the last one, but if it was, she would have been a Macdonald of Kingsborough, and this sounds like it was someone of the chief's family.
Another listener asked if you could expand on her husband's family. I think you've done that. He was also Macdonald, but of a different clan than Flora.
Yes, there were, I mean, there were a lot of Macdonalds and there are a lot of MacLeods.
Yes.
And those of you who've been to Skye, I'm sure you'll have gone to Dunvegan Castle, which has a fairy flag, and that belongs to the MacLeods. And then the other big family is the Macdonalds of Slate, and Flora's stepfather and also her husband belong to that sept of the Macdonalds. And it's a shame about her husband, because he looked the part. He looked the most marvelous figure of a Highlander.
Someone else asks, and I think you mentioned, you talked a little bit about her sons. Did any of her children accompany Alan and she to the U.S.? And are there any descendants in the U.S.?
No, I'm sorry, that's a very good point. Yes, 4 of her sons went with her. The one I mentioned, the Marine, was subsequently lost at sea. And the other 3, they all 4 who went with her fought in different Highland militia, or one of them was in Captain Tarleton's Legion, but they all fought for the crown in different parts of America, North America, because they were on garrison duty in Nova Scotia too. But not only Ranald, but another son was lost at sea. So 2 were lost, and none of them stayed there. Almost, I mean, they all came back to London, and in fact, they all came back to Scotland. So the only one who stayed out for a considerable period of time out of England, out of Scotland rather, was her son Johnny out in Sumatra, and the others came back, but it doesn't mean that descendants haven't subsequently gone to America and North America, and certainly there was a branch of the family who had a black wedding dress belonging to her. They were in Vancouver. So there are, and I've met, even just writing speaking about my book, I've met descendants of Flora. I mean, it was she had quite a lot of children, and then some of her sons had a great many children. So, and one of her daughters emigrated with her husband to Australia. So they were very much, if you like, characteristic of a Scottish family of that time, seeking opportunities wherever they might be. And the Scottish way is to go and look for the opportunities, often out of Scotland.
Well, it's no surprise that many of our listeners tonight were from the Research Triangle in North Carolina, that the second greatest number of listeners, the first being from Central Florida and also then from New Orleans. Close to 200 people attended today, and we're very, very pleased with that. And we thank all of you for being with us. I would remind our members, if you are a member, that our annual membership renewal is coming up. And if you're not a member, it's a good time to become a member, so you get advance notice of all of our programs, like our happy hours and our lecture series. Join a local branch and become part of their events as well. Flora, it's been a real pleasure and a thrill to hear you, and I look forward to reading your book. And with that, I will turn things over to our director.
Thank you, Bill.
Anyway, thank you so much, Flora. It was a pleasure meeting you a few weeks ago. I almost got you to join us at our Shakespeare competition a few weeks ago, but at another time. And maybe we can convince you to come to the United States and be part of our Wrench Speakers program. We'd love to have you. Thank you again for a fascinating lecture. I learned a lot about the Scottish Highlands, which I think sounds like an amazing place. And I know that so many of our listeners have ancestry there. So it was a wonderful connection. Again, thank you, Bill, for making the comment about our membership renewal. I can't say enough. We are a membership organization, and we do want your membership. So if you're not a member, please become one today. We're about to go into our membership drive for the year. Also, I invite you back on June the 7th for a lecture on bourbon from our Kentucky branch. I always find this whole discussions on liquor over Zoom is kind of fascinating, but we do get an incredible response. We had one on port wine almost a year ago. So I think that there is an interest, but somehow drinking alone in front of a screen can be challenging, but obviously the history of it or the environment around it is important. So please join us on the 7th and also on the 21st when we do our own online celebration of the King's coronation. Anyway, thank you all again and have a wonderful evening.